April 1941, South Bend, Indiana. The air was thick with the scent of spring rain and the industrial soot of the Midwest. Inside the wood-paneled executive offices of the Studebaker Corporation at 1600 Broadway, a courier delivered a yellow envelope that would effectively end the civilian world as South Bend knew it. The telegram didn't ask for a favor. It issued a mandate. The United States government needed trucks, not by the dozen, but by the tens of thousands. And they needed them for a global conflagration that America, officially at least, was still trying to ignore. At that moment, the Studebaker factory stood as a cathedral of iron and glass, a monument to the pioneers who had crossed the plains in Studebaker wagons decades earlier. But while the directors stared at the telegram, 5,000 miles to the east, the world was screaming. The Soviet Union, once shielded by a hollow non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, was about to face the most brutal betrayal in human history. On June 22nd, Operation Barbarossa would ignite, unleashing 3 million German soldiers across a frontier that spanned from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The German blitzkrieg was a masterpiece of mechanized cruelty. It wasn't just about tanks, it was about the speed of supply. As the Soviet industry in Ukraine and Belarus crumbled into ash under the Luftwaffe's fire, the Red Army found itself paralyzed. It was a giant with broken legs. Courage was plentiful, but mobility was non-existent. Without trucks, the finest artillery in the world was just heavy scrap metal sitting in a ditch. Without trucks, millions of tons of grain rotted in Siberian silos, while frontline soldiers starved in their foxholes. The Soviet soldier was forced to march on foot into the teeth of a motorized predator. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a man who saw the chessboard of history 3 moves ahead, knew that Lend-Lease was the only antidote to a global Nazi hegemony. He signed the act on March 11th, turning America into the arsenal of democracy. But Roosevelt's calculus was cold and pragmatic. He didn't need to like Stalin, he just needed Stalin to keep fighting. He knew that if the Red Army collapsed, the Atlantic would become a German lake, and the American dream would be strangled in its cradle. To prevent this, the Soviets needed wheels. They needed a machine that could survive the Russian mud, the Rasputitsa, which swallowed tanks whole. They needed a truck that could breathe in -40-degree winds. And so, the burden of the Western world's survival fell upon the draftsmen and line workers of South Bend. The contract was signed. The clock was ticking. The Studebaker US-6 was no longer a blueprint. It was the only thing standing between a free world and 1,000 years of darkness. The challenge facing Studebaker in April 1941 was not just a matter of production. It was a crisis of engineering. They were masters of the luxury sedan and the sturdy farm wagon, but they had never built a 666 military Predator. They had no blueprints for the complex all-wheel drive systems required to conquer the Eurasian steppes, and they had exactly 8 weeks to find them. The engineers in South Bend became prisoners of their own drawing boards, working in shifts that obliterated the boundary between midnight and noon. They tore apart prototypes from competitors, analysed every bolt of the GMC designs, and then built something tougher. The result was the Studebaker US-6, a masterpiece of rugged simplicity. At its heart lay the Hercules JXD 6-cylinder engine. By modern standards, its 87 horsepower seems modest, but the Hercules wasn't built for speed. It was built for survival. It was an omnivorous beast. In the desperate fields of the Eastern Front, where high-octane fuel was a myth, The Hercules engine proved it could run on low-grade gasoline, kerosene, or even a desperate cocktail of alcohol and oil. It was an engine that refused to die, a mechanical heart designed to beat in the coldest reaches of the human experience. The theatre for this industrial miracle was Building 84. Designed by the legendary Albert Kahn, this 6-story cathedral of concrete and glass spanned 800,000 square feet. It was a vertical river of steel. On the lower floors, chassis frames were welded with a fury of sparks. On the second and third, the Hercules engines and heavy-duty axles were mated to the frames. As the trucks rose through the building, story by story, they were infused with the lifeblood of an empire. Wiring, insulated steel cabs, and those iconic triangular vent windows. By late 1941, Building 84 was humming with 23,000 workers. They were a microcosm of the American dream. Polish immigrants, farmers from the Indiana plains, and thousands of women who had traded their aprons for welding masks. The Soviet Union had issued one chilling demand: give us closed cabs. They knew that a Russian winter was a more efficient killer than a German Mauser. An open cab meant a frozen driver within 30 miles. Studebaker responded with steel-clad enclosures and vacuum-operated wipers mounted on the roof. Every truck that rolled off the 6th-floor inspection line wasn't just a vehicle. It was a promise made by the workers of Indiana to a soldier they would never meet, 5,000 miles away. They knew that in the mud of the Volga there would be no second chances. Shipping nearly 200,000 trucks to a nation under siege was a logistical nightmare that defied the laws of geography. The Studebaker US-6 didn't just drive to the front. It had to survive a gauntlet of fire across 3 continents. The first route was the Murmansk Run, a suicide mission through the Arctic Circle. Convoy after convoy of merchant ships, loaded with Studebakers, braved the freezing spray of the North Atlantic, while German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers hunted them like wolves. Thousands of trucks never saw land. They rest forever on the ocean floor, still strapped to the decks of sunken Liberty ships. But the ones that got through were driven straight into the frozen heart of the Soviet resistance, their tires touching Russian soil for the first time in the permanent twilight of the Arctic. Then there was the Persian Corridor, a brutal, sun-scorched alternative. Trucks were shipped to the Persian Gulf, offloaded in the searing heat of Iran, and driven north through mountain passes that felt like the edge of the world. This route was the domain of the Persian Gulf Command, many of whom were African-American soldiers. In an era of bitter segregation back home, these men became the master navigators of the desert. They coaxed the Studebakers over sand dunes and through blinding dust storms, repairing engines in 120-degree heat with nothing but hand tools and raw ingenuity. They weren't allowed to fight in the trenches, but they were the ones who ensured the Red Army had the wheels to win. Finally, there was the Pacific route, the longest and most surreal journey of all. Trucks were shipped from the west coast of America to Vladivostok, then loaded onto the Trans-Siberian Railway for a journey that spanned 6 time zones. By the time a Studebaker reached the front lines near Moscow or Stalingrad, it had travelled over 10,000 miles by sea, rail and mud. Soviet engineers conducted ruthless field tests comparing the American Stutter to their own domestic models. The verdict was unanimous. The Studebaker was a godsend. It could carry double its rated payload, groaning under 4 tons of ammunition without snapping an axle. To the Soviet soldier, the Studebaker wasn't just a piece of Lend-Lease equipment. It was the king of roads, a mechanical miracle that appeared from the mist of a distant ally to turn the tide of a losing war. As the tide began to turn at Stalingrad, the Studebaker US-6 evolved from a mere transport vehicle into a weapon of psychological and physical annihilation. The Red Army, desperate for a mobile platform to carry their terrifying BM-13 rocket launchers, discovered that their domestic ZS-5 trucks were simply too weak to handle the violent recoil and the massive weight of the rails. But the Studebaker? It was as if it had been forged for this exact purpose. Soviet engineers stripped the cargo beds from the US-6, welding heavy steel frameworks directly to the American chassis. This was the birth of the legendary Katyusha mounted on a Studebaker. When a battery of these trucks unleashed their payload, the world seemed to tear apart. 16 132mm rockets would scream into the sky in less than 10 seconds, delivering 8,000 pounds of high explosives onto German positions. The sound was a haunting metallic shriek, a roar that German infantrymen came to call Stalin's organ. It was a symphony of destruction that defined the final years of the war. Out of the 1,800 Katyusha units built in 1943, nearly every single one was mounted on a Studebaker US-6. The American truck provided the speed to strike and the reliability to disappear before German counter-battery fire could find them. But the Studebaker's true genius was invisible. It was the backbone of the deep battle doctrine. While German panzers were running out of fuel and their horses were dying in the snow, the Red Army was moving. Studebaker supply columns, stretching for miles, followed the Soviet tank spearheads with a relentless tenacity. They drove through the night without headlights, their drivers navigating by the smell of diesel and the vibration of the earth. They hauled anti-tank guns, bridge-building equipment, and entire field hospitals. Nikita Khrushchev later admitted that without these trucks, the Soviet offensives would have stalled in the mud, and the road to Berlin would have been paved with millions more Soviet corpses. The Studebaker didn't just carry supplies, it carried the momentum of victory. By August 1945, the thunder of Building 84 finally began to subside. The war was over. The 23,000 workers of South Bend watched as the last military Studebaker US-6 rolled off the line, a quiet end to a production run that had changed the world. Between 1941 and 1945, this single factory had churned out nearly 198,000 trucks, a mechanical tidal wave that had washed over the Eastern Front and crashed into the gates of Berlin. But as the victory parades ended, the Studebaker faced a different kind of survival. In the Soviet Union, the stutter didn't go to the scrap heap. It became the backbone of reconstruction. For decades after the war, you could still see Studebakers hauling grain on collective farms in Ukraine, transporting timber in the Siberian taiga, and serving as mobile workshops in cities that were being rebuilt from rubble. And Soviet engineers were so impressed by the US-6 that they used its blueprints as the DNA for the next generation of Russian trucks. The GAZ-51 and the ZIS-151 weren't just influenced by the Studebaker. They were its mechanical descendants. To the Russian people, the Studebaker became more than a tool. It was a symbol of a time when the world stood together against darkness. Back in Indiana, however, the story had a bitter edge. The company that had helped save the world couldn't save itself. Studebaker, once a titan of industry, struggled to adapt to the post-war civilian market. While their trucks were legends in Moscow, their cars faced brutal competition at home. In December 1963, the lights in the South Bend factory were turned off for the last time. 7,000 workers lost their jobs in a single day. and most of the 38 buildings were demolished, reduced to dust and memory. Only Building 84 remained, standing like a silent brick sentinel over a vanished empire. But look closely at the streets of Moscow today during the Victory Day parades. You will see them. Meticulously restored Studebaker US-6s, their engines still purring with that legendary Hercules roar. Old veterans, their chests heavy with medals, reach out to touch the cold steel of the fenders, remembering the mud of Stalingrad and the long road to Berlin. They don't see an American product, they see a lifeline. The Studebaker US-6 proved that in the desperate calculus of war, good enough at a massive scale is worth more than perfect in small numbers. It was the truck that gave an army its feet, a nation its hope, and history its direction. Built in Indiana, driven in Russia, and remembered as the king of roads,